Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to a 2022 Photo London webinar, A Question of Ice. My name is Bill Fox. I'm your moderator for this evening. I'm the director of the Center for Art and Environment at the Nevada Museum of Art in Reno, Nevada, which has a huge archive of, among other things, contemporary Antarctic art projects. And we specialize in art of remote environments, among other things. So that's where we can see that interface most clearly between art and environmental concerns. I've published 15 books on cognition, art, and landscape. They're set variously in the Antarctic, the Arctic, the Himalaya, and the deserts of Chile, Australia, and the United States. And much of that work has involved writing about photography in remote environments. I'm usually described as an art critic, but sometimes as a science writer or cultural geographer as well. I'm joined today by the artists Jean de Pomereux and Daniel Schwartz, whom I'll introduce shortly. They will each make a presentation of about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of time for conversation and questions. Please use your question and answer, your Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, wherever it appeals, to submit questions in writing. You won't have any interaction with us except through that. You as audience won't be heard on the webinar as usual. Jean de Pomereux specializes in the visual culture of Antarctica. He photographs, he edits, he curates, and he does historical research as well. He originally focused first on Antarctica's topographical abstraction, if you will, and its minerality, its mineral nature. And his photographic work has more recently concentrated on the interaction of what Alfred Stieglitz called the human hand, or the hand of man, and ice. In 2006, Jean was the official photographer for Alida Albuquerque's Stellar Axis Antarctica project that was funded by the National Science Foundation, and it was the first and largest land art installation ever taken on that continent still today. He's also worked with the Salto Ulbeck publishers to co-edit the first platinum palladium prints and portfolios made from the original negatives of some of the earliest Antarctic photographers, including Frank Hurley and Herbert Ponting. He's currently a Marie Curie Research Fellow at the Scott Polar Research Institute at Cambridge, University of Cambridge. Daniel Schwartz studied photography at the Zurich School of Art and Design. He's a member of the Seven Photo Agency and has had numerous solo exhibitions, most recently at the Grisons Museum of Fine Arts in Switzerland. His work has also been featured in many group shows, including the Venice Art and Architecture Biennales in 1993 and 2004. In 1987, 1988, Daniel became the first foreigner and photographer to travel along the Great Wall of China. His reportage in South and Southeast Asia's deltas between 1991 and 1995 were early photojournalistic investigations into habitats endangered by consequences of climate crisis, and that's part of his talk today, actually. His project on collapsing glaciers on 3 continents culminated in a marvelous book so far, While the Fires Burn, a Glacier Odyssey, which was published in 2017 by Thames and Hudson. It was also featured in Photo London magazine number 10. As you might surmise from these descriptions, the two artists have very different practices. Jean is dealing with what he calls the typology of absence on a continent, which has been far more photographed than walked over. Daniel is documenting glaciers disappearing in the deeply storied mountain ranges of the world, and he's perhaps photographing memories as much as the physical world. But both men are bound together because they're photographing ice, one of the most common minerals in our universe, where water is rare and ice is common. Our planet is relatively unique in that it is 2/3 covered by water, but also that H2O here exists at a very rare triple point when it's hovering around the temperature of freezing. It can exist as a solid, as a liquid, and as a vapor. It can transition from solid to vapor without even being a liquid. It can do this all at the same temperature in the same place at the same time. It's amazing. And then we see that process of sublimation occurring most often when we're actually standing on ice, on a glacier often, for example, which is one of the reasons it fascinates us so. Ice is solid, yet it flows, disappears into thin air only to fall out of the sky as snow, which can then turn into solid sheets of ice 10,000 feet thick. So it's a remarkable element. And it's, of course, now implicated with the survival of our species. I'm going to ask Gene to lead off by talking about his work in the Antarctic. And then once he's done, Daniel will take over. I will be absent during all of this. You won't see me or hear me. Daniel will take over to describe his journey that took him from the river deltas of Asia into the Swiss Alps and mountains elsewhere around the world. That's vastly oversimplifying his story, but It's a one thread, one narrative thread. And you'll hear from me again once Daniel is finished and we're all three ready for conversation and questions. And I will try to capture your questions from the Q&A. So with that, Jean de Pomeroy.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be taking part in this talk. And I just wanted to add that aside from Bill's hugely influential writings, he was key in the realization and the possibility of doing Stellar Access Antarctica, Lito Albuquerque's land art installation in Antarctica, which he mentioned. And he's also contributed to the portfolios, which on early Antarctic photography, which I'll mention shortly. So I will now share my screen. So I hope I'm full screen for everyone. To begin this talk, I'm going to take you down to Antarctica, of course, and just to give you a little bit of background and a reminder that Antarctica is positioned around the South Pole and is approximately twice the size of the United States. But, and this is important in terms of the images that I'm about to show you, it is a continent without any native populations, no vegetation higher than a few centimeters, and it is covered by ice, 97% covered by ice. My own fascination with Antarctica and its visual representation is not that original, in that it began with the iconic photographs of Herbert Ponting, taken during Captain Scott's fateful Terra Nova expedition in 1910 to 1913. Ponting referred to himself as a camera artist and was the first professional photographer to visit the continent. His compositions were imbued with the aesthetics of romanticism and the sublime, as you can see in this image. This was an aesthetics in which the subject, and in this case, ships and men, are choreographed to provide notions of depth, perspective, and scale to icescapes that offer none. That is to say, icescapes that characterize Antarctica with their absence of vegetation and until just a century ago, the absence of human habitations. Not only was I captivated by Ponting's mastery of composition, where man is made to look tiny, almost insignificant, amid the forces of nature and grandeur of Antarctic landscapes, but this fascination indirectly led to my working on Antarctic photographic archives with my colleagues at the Salto Ulbeek Publishing, which is based in Belgium. And eventually we published together the first portfolio of Ponting's Antarctic photographs, printed in platinum palladium from the original negatives of which are kept at the Scott Polar Research Institute here in Cambridge. Indeed, I was similarly fascinated by the slightly later photographs of Ernest Shackleton's photographer, Frank Hurley, the Australian, during the famous Endurance expedition of 1914 to 1918, during which the Endurance, his ship, famously got trapped in ice and sank before being recently rediscovered in an amazing state of conservation at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. There are, of course, many parallels between the romantically inspired work of Ponting and Hurley, and we went on to co-publish a platinum palladium printed portfolio of his work with the negatives, which are also kept at the Scott Polar Research Institute, but also at the Royal Geographical Society in London. These two institutions worked with us to produce this portfolio. So that's a kind of background to how I came to Antarctica and to Antarctic photography and met and collided with the great works of the past. But moving on to my own photography, at an early stage with my first visits to Antarctica, my admiration for Ponting and Hurley's work resulted in photographs in which I sought to, as it were, humanize the Antarctic landscapes as they had done before me. Here with a landing strip, and here with two pilgrims, as I like to call them. But then, as I developed my topography of absent series between 2002 and 2008 over several trips to Antarctica, I was increasingly attracted and interested in the topographic abstraction that characterizes much of Antarctica's icescapes. Having been exposed and admired as abstraction in all of its various expressions in Western art, and this in a way that was not possible to Ponting, Hurley, or any other early Antarctic photographers, I became more interested in Antarctica's distilled and often confusing minerality, such as challenges human perceptions of and cognition, as is beautifully explored by Bill Fox in his own writings, For me, the subject became the absence of scale and perspective, ultimately resulting in this image, where ice and sky morph as one into whiteness. This is a photograph that echoes this pre-climate change quote by the American explorer Richard E. Byrd, writing about his experiences in Antarctica. The end of the world will probably look like this. The last man retreating from the cliffs will look out upon such horizons, with all things at last in equilibrium, the winds quiet, the sea frozen, and the sky composed, and the earth in glacial quietude. And so I continued to seek this abstract and reductive minerality offered by the Antarctic landscape, sometimes at sea, such as in these images and in this one, and sometimes on land, as in the next series, Contours of Silence, taken in 2008. For me, these landscapes, despite their otherworldly alienness, offered a sense of peace and freedom, as well as one of quietude. They are an attempt to record what I would term Antarctica's visual silence, a silence that is also visible in this series. Sorry, I'm a bit behind. In this series here, Sans Nom, which I was fortunate to be able to take thanks to a Russian scientist who offered to take me on a skidoo ride amongst a field of icebergs imprisoned by the sea ice during the winter months. For about 6 hours on a hazy but sunlit night in late spring, we traveled through what can only be described as a frozen Atlantis, where icebergs took the place of ancient ruins, each of them without a name. These fleeting features, sans nom, would eventually drift out to sea and melt when the sea ice chose to release them. Here again, the silence was profound until this happened. As we traveled back to land, a fissure in the ice appeared before us, and we stopped so that I could photograph it. To be sure, this was a natural phenomenon, typical of this time of year, when spring turns to summer and the sea ice starts to disintegrate. But then, on returning to France, the photograph took on a life of its own. First of all, in being selected for this exhibition at the Whatcom Museum near Seattle, and being chosen for the cover of the exhibition catalog. Then, in circulating the internet, where it was described as an expression, and in some cases a terrifying proof of the effects of climate change. Although I was perfectly happy with this photograph being used to wear awareness about what we are facing, fundamentally, there was a problem. This was not a representation of climate change. Climate change can only be read in a decadal recording and frequency of such events, not in a single photograph. And so the question was thrust upon me, how might it be possible to overcome this untruth and represent the effects of climate change on Antarctic ice? As you will see later in Daniel's presentation, this is also a question that lies at the core of his work. And if photographing an iceberg just wouldn't cut it, what would? My solution emerged from my familiarization with a vast archive of breathtaking aerial photographs of Antarctica that were taken by the US Geological Survey for cartographic purposes during the Cold War. These were authorless photographs taken by automatic 3-lens cameras pointing through the undercarriage of aircraft flying in straight lines. One lens pointed vertically downwards and 2 were positioned in an oblique fashion so that they could record the horizon to the left and to the right of the plane. Borrowing these photographs as a basis for my new project, I decided to draw on Alfred Stieglitz's phrase, "the hand of man," when alluding to our human transformation of natural environments. And so, if this particular fissure wasn't the product of the hand of man, this one was. Here, it was literally my hand, echoing the hand of man, that had brought these new fissures to the sea ice photographed from the air by the Geological Survey. I went on to devise a simple geometrical grammar of incisions, tears, and laying of photographic material to express the hand of man in echoes to the natural ice features photographed from the sky. This, I hope, creates a non-literal dialogue between the natural and human forces in the permanent but augmenting transformation of Antarctic ice. Here, contrasting natural ice boundaries with straight lines, such as only humans can produce and are impossible to find in nature. The white in this aerial photograph is the surface of the ice, and the black is the ocean as it appears from the sky. Even where I'm incorporating black areas, these are photographic images of the ocean. I also begin to play with the idea of human-made icebergs versus natural ones, such as in this work. And also in this one. Or veering further into geometrical abstraction by using the same aerial photographs of ice surface and ocean to express the deficit and disappearance of ice as driven by human activities. Or here, an evocation of the progressive disintegration of ice bodies with a contrast between simple human geometries, the straight line, and the infinite complexities of natural geometries, the bergy bits and their broken porcelain appearance. And here, the sequential carving and drifting of a part of ice bodies. I should point out that these are layered images where surfaces are mounted on top of each other. And finally, in this ceramic piece consisting of tiles on which has been impressed an aerial photograph of sea ice in its formation stage as Antarctic summer turns into autumn. That is to say, a mineral process of infinite variability and reorganization, to which I add an extra layer of complexity by inviting humans to rearrange the tiles in an infinite number of combinations, thus echoing our invisible human hand on these most distant, yet intimately interconnected Antarctic environments. Thank you, and I'll pass over to Daniel now.
Thank you, Sean, for preparing the landing zone. I hope my landing will not crash the ice, so I try to walk gently. Yeah, as I don't need to say a lot about myself, as the most important things have been said. I'm a Swiss photographer or artist, if we decide to distinguish the two of them, or if we allow to settle the former in the realm of the latter. But this is a discussion which authors usually do not bother about, but let history decide. So I'm pleased to focus on subject matter rather than on the distinction of the medium. I will speak a little bit, not necessarily directly to the pictures, but speak a little bit and then run through some pictures silently. So it will be a little bit, there's a difference between my presentation and the one of Sean. I hope that is good for everybody concerned. So let me start with general remark that connects two of my books and exhibition projects, and both can be understood as counterparts. The first is As it has been mentioned, Delta, the Perils, Profits and Politics of Water in South and Southeast Asia, very long title, published in 1995, and Wildfires Burn the Glacier Odyssey, published in 2017. Both projects are documentary and informative and concerned with a long perspective. Far from being a reaction to events, my work as a photojournalist is a commitment defined by observation that seeks to localize and follow ecological and political developments and their social and cultural consequences over many years and over large geographical expanses. So I let this picture now here stand a little bit alone because it's sort of a trompe-l'oeil thing, and if you look at it carefully long enough, you will discover things happening on that glacier table. Through direct observation and through the archive and the laboratory of the past, I wish to communicate a sense of relationship between humans and the Earth. We understand that our relationship and planetary activities, which had begun in the Holocene, have meanwhile resulted in the geological time unit of the Anthropocene. But as of yet, we do not have a concept of an Anthropocene society. And as we rethink the human environment relationship, we are forced to ask ourselves what being human means, and that requires an understanding of human history with that of the Earth system. So much of my work of the past 30 years can be understood as a contribution towards this effort. I let this stand from the Delta and referred to the picture of the glacier table in Afghanistan, which I've seen before with the armed man sitting on it. Glaciers, as you will remember, did not figure at all during the past 20 years of failed peace enforcing and nation building attempts by the International Alliance and Committee, despite the fact that the state has major implications on any peace agreement, post-war reconstruction efforts, and so forth, and most notably on food security. In Afghanistan, where glaciers are a source of water needed for critical late-season crop irrigation and fighting, increasingly takes place outside the traditional season. Glaciers thus have indirectly become a variable of the current course of war. And as we know, and as we also are reminded now what happens in Ukraine, war is never kind, not only to humans, but also never kind to the environment. So Delta, the Perils, Delta was a photojournalistic investigation into the consequences of the climate crisis, and emphasis was, as you have seen in the preceding images, the condition humaine in the deltaic regions. Back then, 30 years ago, in the densely populated estuaries and deltas of the Ganges, Brahmaputra and Mekong, as well as the Irrawaddy, the loss of land due to overuse, erosion and sinking could already be observed. Documented in the book Delta were people's attitudes towards the natural world, especially to the rivers. And the overriding theme was human resilience. I let the picture stand as well, because then you can have a look at the captions below and interpret the images with the information of the captions. In Switzerland, terrain does not disappear, but is emerging at the price of retreating and vanishing glaciers. Since the end of the Little Ice Age, around the mid-19th century, Swiss alpine glaciers lost about 60% of their mass, 37% alone since 1980. Collapse and retreat are accelerating since 2011, and by current melt rates, almost complete extinction is expected by the end of this century. Well before this future reality of green Alps by 2040, Swiss glaciers will have wasted down to a size making it impossible to fill man-made reservoirs in the winter. Foreseeable, therefore, is the conflict between the agricultural sector, which wants to use river water for irrigation during spells of heat and drought, and the hydropower plants, which need to store the water to cover peak power demand in winter. So, rather than in the physical state of snowflakes, water will come increasingly liquid, potentially together with severe flooding. And thus, Swiss and Europeans, as we have seen last summer, face challenges once reserved for the people of the deltas only. In this diptych, or rather in this counterpart, you see also one is a close-up of a carcass and a dead child after cyclone aftermath. The other is looking down from the helicopter on the Findel Glacier, and this picture, it might remind you to bodies of mammoths extracted from Siberian permafrost. So rather, it's rather anthropomorphic, or it reminds, I'm looking at the glaciers as a living thing. Of course, I try to understand and depict the mechanics of a glacier, but at times a glacier, a dying glacier, looks like a living thing, and actually it is. It responds, of course, with a time lapse. So if we look at the glacier from today, we see the deeds of the 1970s. Part of my research is based on maps. And this is a map, if you look carefully at, this is Switzerland about 20,000 years ago at the height of the last glacial maximum. And at the end, so all the Alps are covered by ice, and you see this huge shield of ice which covers the alpine foreland. At the tongue of it, you see a tiny line, and this tiny line is a walk around the imagined end of the glacier, which has disappeared. And during that walk, encounters with 25 peoples were made, and their consumed lifespan or lived lifespan accumulated to the time span of 935 years. I did that in order to evoke, of course, the Holocene relics of the glacier, but also to put human lifespans in relation to glaciological time, because in here there's a problem of, or has been a problem the past 30 years, to make people understand that things are happening quicker than we thought. Now, this is stone lines. They might remind you of the work of Richard Long or Hamish Fulton. Actually has been done by anonymous artists or peasants or shepherds who were depending on meltwater in the Swiss Alps. It's Rhone glacier terminus lines between fixed like this between 1874 and 1887. Another way of resources, it's weather observations by a Lucerne historian, the town scribe of Lucerne in the 16th, beginning 17th century. He's recording the weather signals, and that was the peak of really when harvests didn't work, people were hungry, there were riots, things we know these days now from Haiti or other places which we call failed states. So there were food riots in Switzerland, and children were seen eating grass and all that. So between the Enlightenment era and the end of the Second World War, the Alpine Range was configured as essential for the Swiss nation. First, its physicality was understood as shared and unifying natural feature, allowing heterogeneous societies, which populated an ideal, pastoral, yet also frightening landscape. Against the backdrop of nationalism that arose beyond the borders, the mountains were fortified as impregnable redoubt. The Reduit aimed to deter potential German invasion and deny access and used the passes and tunnels as transportation infrastructure and were portrayed as a manifestation of Swiss national character. But will Green Alps, I wonder, and dark peaks still qualify as a national symbol? If such was the Swiss background against which I embarked on the project, Wildfire Spurn, A Glacier Odyssey, charging mountain landscapes with patriotic and heroic meaning, however, is far from being a historic feat and limited to my homeland. Melting glaciers, as you know, can shift boundaries between adjacent watersheds that follow mountain ridges and thus can lead to disputes over high altitude, bordering border territories, because regional politics must secure access to resources. For instance, since 1984, in the Himalayan environment, India, Pakistani and Chinese troops are locked in a costly, silent and deadly standoff in sub-zero temperatures at the Siachen Glacier, where disputed territories meet a line of control, itself a legacy of an earlier border war. Now, this is a work, consists of a text work and not of a photograph, and it's a modest contribution, hopefully, to the understanding of glacier mechanic. In some years, or maybe in a decade now, the film canister with my exposed films will be discovered and maybe even processed, and because we inserted the flight manifesto and the signatures of everybody in the helicopter, including with the coordinates. So people might then find out how this film canister traveled, and maybe we will glean some information about the speeds at the bottom of the ice shield of the Rhone Glacier, which by then will have disappeared. So Wildfire Spurn, that project traces my journey along humanity's troubled or perhaps suicidal path of progress. From the relics of the Holocene glaciation, as you have seen, it leads into the milieu of the Anthropocene to collapsing glaciers on 3 continents. The subject of the work is the glacier's repertoire and function as a gorge of anthropogenic global warming and an imperial storehouse of resources, as a fast disappearing archive of climate and cultural history, as a glacial archaeological find spot, place and remembrance and metaphor of memory, and as a source of social and national identity. Here, of course, we deal with it as a glacial archaeological find spot. The set of 3 mountaineers who went lost in 1926 were found in 2012, and the set of bones was a perfect exercise for glaciologists to retrace where they came from and their travel speed. Indeed, was my glacier project the first one with the active participation of academics from the field of glaciology, climate science and cartography. And as they breathed my eye, they did so, of course, as successors of the naturalists who in the early 18th century had replaced God's ire and cataclysmic floods with modern experimental glaciology. My project outcome, therefore, is the result of a synthesis of scientific observation and artistic action, which helps to understand environmental processes. It is a glaciology in pictures. As I started out for my Glacier Odyssey, it was clear that my glaciology pictures would neither be a systematic photogeology as attempted, for instance, by Aimé Vicidiale, one of the pioneers of alpine photography, nor yet another rephotography project. I aimed at a visual interpretation of the agony of the cryosphere that combined the thoroughgoingness of a political statement with the zest to produce a document that will be relevant for future scientific research. Decisive, therefore, was the understanding of the processes of a dramatically changing cryosphere. For the first time, I explored the possibilities of the dramatically true aviatic perspective. The explanatory had to be differentiated from the aesthetical, and the latter had to be resolutely avoided. I began to instill a lingering sense of vertigo in my images that I felt corresponded with my view of a world being out of order. In the context of mountains, this order had to do with the sublime postulated by Edmund Burke in his philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas on the sublime and beautiful. Burke associates the sublime with terror, the beautiful with order. In While the Fires Burn, the Swiss photographs constitute a Theatrum Alpinum. The title, however, can be read as a salute to Caspar Wolff, a precursor of European Romantic painting. Wolff merged geodesy and the sublime. As he vanished into oblivion, editors set out to modify his paintings according to the taste of the time. His figures, examining glacier tables, became ant-sized humans precariously placed under the colossal boulders. That was the picture which I opened my presentation. Wolff had made mountains geologically readable. His skies are instrumental in making them a geographic reality. In my photographs, a horizon is the exception. Even when I'm looking at it, it is looking down on erosion, collapse, and vanishing. Sceneries are dissected just as glaciers are. Thank you very much.
Terrific. See if we're all back together now. Is that possible? Thank you. Here we are. Yeah. So we don't have any questions yet. We just have one comment that how incredible the presentations are. So I encourage you, our audience, to please submit any questions you have on the Q&A button that's on the bottom of your screen. It is always a reminder to me of how things are connected. I mean, the Antarctica, Switzerland, the Himalaya, the river deltas around the world, all of these things are connected to the force of water and ice. And that process of sublimation, that kind of magical idea that something goes from being a solid to a vapor, apparently effortlessly, that's in a funny kind of a way analogous to the process of your two careers, your practices, your involvement with ice. In that, you become increasingly abstract in the presentation of physical reality. So I love your word, Daniel. It becomes vertiginous. You're looking at these land and ice forms juxtaposed, and you're in the air, and the positive and negative kind of flip back and forth for the viewer. Am I looking at the glacier? Am I looking at the mountain? What am I doing? Especially, I really appreciate the fact that you actually have been able to photograph the Ruwenzori, which is such a magical place on the planet because it's so difficult to get an unclouded view of those mountains. And a source, of course, of one of the great rivers of the world in Africa. So that idea that you transform from a kind of a literal representation of a place and its history, and then something becomes more metaphorical as you go on in your practice. That to me is a kind of sublimation. That's a transformation of a state of aesthetics. It's not just a fancy, it's an actual change in the presentation of your work. So I guess, Jean, could you describe just a little bit more your research practice? How did you find those USGS images from the Trimetrogron cameras carried in the bellies of airplanes. As I said, Antarctica has been more photographed than it's been, walked over. How did you find those photographs?
Actually, it was in working on the portfolios, ironically, and just digging into archives with my colleague at Salto Ulbeck that I first came upon them. I came upon them as prints, which are scattered around various institutions. But the negatives themselves are stored in the US and were decaying, so have recently been scanned, thankfully. But yes, I first came upon them as material prints, disorganized in a cellar, basically. And I think that these images are becoming more and more relevant. There has been attempts to use them for. One of the problems with them is that as the planes flew in straight lines and captured image after image on a second by second basis, it probably you could set the camera to capture a new image depending on altitude every 5, 10, 20 seconds. As they did that, however, there was a problem of calibration. They didn't have the land. When the images came back to the cartographers who were supposed to make sense out of them, they didn't have it was difficult to recognize the features in the ice, and especially as they're so abstract. And to actually, you need to calibrate and to recognize the feature in order to then position the line to then and the image and in space, and then to make a map out of it. And actually, it turned out to be quite an imprecise methodology, although very expensive, because they did many of these flights, which cost a fortune in fuel and resources. Are paradoxical, of course, within the context of what fuel does to the atmosphere. But anyway, but it was the material, the raw images were actually proved very quickly redundant, because they were difficult to process, they were difficult to position in space in a precise way, they were difficult to use to make maps, and then satellites came around and were much more precise and speed and fast and efficient. So basically, this archive it's both mesmerizing in its vastness and its quality, and it's somewhat redundant in scientific terms. But it of course, the last thing that should happen to it is that it should be forgotten. So it's too precious a thing for it to just sort of sit dormant. And that was one of the things that really was at the back of my head for many years, as to, this archive deserves better, and it deserves better than just printing or whatever. It deserves interpretation, and it deserves to be engaged with. And then as I described in my talk, this moment happened in my career when I started really thinking about the difficulty of representing the change and the melting of ice and the fracturing of ice and the effects of climate change on ice. And then the two came together, and this need to work on these images, and so what I felt was a solution or a use for them that would actually transcend them and actually be I'll end on this. They would be value added, basically, in both scientific and aesthetic terms.
Well, it's
very aesthetic, but in terms of artistic terms, yeah.
It's very gratifying that you recognize the value of that archive, which has been sublimating in its own way into thin air. And that you're using it for a more metaphorical purpose, that there's actually beyond its lifespan as a scientific tool or a tool of the military-industrial complex, trying to figure out where you might have to go if foreign troops land in the Antarctic. It's great that that's been repurposed to some extent, and I'm delighted to hear that those images have been scanned, because that was going to be lost. So Daniel, in counter-distinction to this, the glaciers of Switzerland have been more rephotographed, I believe, than any others in the world. I believe the practice of rephotography, I think, is actually invented on the Swiss glaciers in the 19th century. And there's an entire book, for example, just of the scientific knowledge on the reef photography about the Mer de Glace. I mean, just one glacier. And the Rhone Glacier, you show that remarkable photograph of the sheets covering the glacier, trying to slow down the melt because a hotel nearby, the Belvedere, has a cave that's a tourist attraction that has to be reopened every summer, again, by actively excavating some of the glacier. And then they try to preserve that financial, monetization of a natural feature. How do you see your work fitting into, again, these materials that you're making towards a culture of the Anthropocene? It's a very broad question. I apologize to both of you for it, but to me, that kind of photograph displaying the evident hand of humans on a melting glacier and kind of this folly of trying to stop it. How do you see that becoming a document of kind of this poignant metaphor for the Anthropocene?
Well, I thought when I saw that for the first time, many years before I photographed it, to me it was a proof of, as you rightly pointed out, the folly, but also if people are faced or confronted with their deeds or things they went wrong or they didn't understand and didn't bother to rethink, the fact to the urge to act is more pressing than to think what to do. So they just do something for the sake that something has been done. We observe that from politicians who think now we have to set a marker, regardless what it is, but it's short-term thinking. And in the case of the Rhone Glacier, where one of these grottos hardly lives the summer and then it collapses and is not accessible anymore. So they actually have to dig out every year a new cave. It's sort of it's just it goes without comment, actually, but I saw it, I tried to see, no, I saw it, or it struck me as a view or scenery which I was used to see from Kurdistan or from Afghanistan, a refugee camp. If you look at it from afar, sort of these seracs, melting seracs. And of course it is a shroud and it has been depicted and interpreted by other photographers, colleagues of mine, as a shroud. I didn't see it as a shroud. That's, if you try to recall the triptych, sort of that particular grotto and the torn fleece, it looked like a skull. To me, it was a skull, and then a skull, sort of like as if the glacier itself had become a dead body, pushing itself towards its visitors. So, and of course, the Rhone Glacier has the advantage or the disadvantage as it is very easily accessible. Already for Goethe, he had to ride his horse across the huge tongue, which extended down into the valley. But there's this road built next by. So, of course, the Swiss, they knew that the mountains are not just a fortress, but also a source of income, by manning the passes, by providing services. John Muir, your American compatriot, was fascinating by the Rigi, by the little railroad that went up to the Rigi, by the accessibility of mountain sceneries. And of course, that's where things started to become where we are now, when nature has become a playground for all sorts of sports. Once we can't do ski, we can't ski anymore, we do other things in the Alps. And you see these activities already now, and I think that's completely the wrong approach. We really, as I said, we really need to think differently. What are we doing to ourselves by screwing up Mother Nature, if you allow me this phrase here in that forum?
Yeah, well, that brings up the issue of, for instance, tourism in the Antarctic. As the Antarctic becomes more accessible, the sea ice breaks up earlier and earlier, and cruise ships now go to in the Ross Sea. They, can take tens of thousands of people to a place that beforehand would see at most 1,000 people in a year when the scientists would go to the McMurdo base. And so the relationship of people constantly going to have glacier tourism now because they're looking at the disappearing glaciers. So that's in part why people go to the Antarctic. They want to see the ice before it disappears. It's certainly part of Switzerland's, appeal. You drive up Furka Pass, so you can peer down on the Rhone Glacier, and it's becoming a part of the more common vocabulary of the Anthropocene. And so I think that the work that both of you are doing, connecting through your research, the history of these places, and then placing it in a more current context, is incredibly valuable to this endeavor. And it's an endeavor that we don't have a choice about. We have to undertake it. So, Jean, in Daniel's terms, do you see yourself working in the Antarctic, increasing human understanding about what is by far and away the most difficult continent on the planet?
I'm not much of a campaigner in that sense. I'm more, I've always, perhaps through my character or whatever, I'm more of a witness, and in a way, and just trying to just show, and in a way that's perhaps devoid of political engagement. I don't see myself I don't see my work as political in that sense. But I see it as tragic, and that's what I love about Daniel's work is just the tragic element, and you also brought up the sublime, the other side of the sublime, which is of course terror, and that terror is very present in your work, which I love. And as for the tourists, as for the tourists, we're all tourists in Antarctica, by the way. Because there's no indigenous populations there. Even scientists, tourists are useful tourists. I mean, perhaps there's more useful and less useful tourists, but let's not go into that. But certainly, what's paradoxical about having experienced that, having lectured on a cruise ship or two, is this engagement with ice, and we're still going there in terms of the tourism industry in Antarctica in a state of delight, in a state of the sublime, of Ponting and Hurley, of magnificence and awe. And actually what's behind this is actually terror and tragedy, but it's just not coming through. It's not penetrating the consciousness. And I guess both of our works are trying to contribute to that. I don't like the word awareness particularly, but just permeating the fact that we are seeing a tragedy, and we're seeing the terrifying side of the sublime unfolding before our eyes, and that there is a kind of inevitability to it because it's built in when it comes to glaciers. I mean, it's very difficult to turn around the momentum of glacial melt. There are, we're very close to, well, in glaciers we're past the point of return in the tipping point in most of the glaciers of the world, or many, and in terms of Antarctica and Greenland, we're nearly there. So we're kind of almost past the point of no return. So here again, it's more about, in my mind, it's more about being witnessing and just engaging with that reality.
Daniel, you're a member of a very well-known photojournalistic agency that is specialized since 9/11, really in conflict photography, among other things. And how does your work sit, your work in the mountains and the glaciers around the world, how does that sit alongside the work of your colleagues in an agency such as that, a commercial agency?
Well, I should say, and I'm happy to say, that Seven has, of course, its DNA is conflict and war photography, but I'm happy to say, and I do my best to help towards that efforts, that it has morphed into a more varied agency. Of course, there are people like Ron, who just has been in Ukraine and had the panel 2 days ago, or Christopher or Eric. They still focus on that, and they're very good on it. But the Seven has opened its doors also towards education. And of course, we do not want to educate people to become war photographers, but rather to be witnesses to society and long-term processes, in a complex world where there are no easy answers. And especially, photographs are never easy answers to complex questions. So my work, before I did some crisis reporting, but also it was always embedded in larger projects, like in the deltas. Of course, I extended the deltas into Cambodia, and that was at the end of the civil war, in Burma as well. And of course, it's strange and it's sad in a way that the work I did 30 years ago in Behind the Bamboo Curtain of Burma did not stop and prevent a military junta taking over a year ago and re-establishing, an Orwellian society. And so I think the same frustration and sadness I hear now from my colleagues who have witnessed the slaughter in the Balkans, and it was in the 20th century, now in the 21st century, and for the second or third time they find themselves on genocidal terrain. So I think what we share, and what I also share with my glacier work, I don't think I can stop climate change and global warming, which what sort of sometimes many campaigners, I think, wish to do as war photographers. Yes, in Vietnam, it was an exception under specific circumstances that the war somehow, photography contributed to stopping the war. But it's frustrating to see that our images, the more and more we look at them as producing the evidence so that people cannot say afterwards, we didn't know it. It has happened, it's evidence, it's on record. And now, of course, our work is being supplemented by citizen journalists' work and all that together. So we are in a completely different environment, and there's no distinction between somebody who does work on a marginalized community, marginalized by race, gender, or other preferences, or religion, or conflict, or the degradation of environment by men.
Yeah, good. Well, Daniel and Jean, I want to congratulate you both for having lived, in my mind, as a curator and a keeper of archives, these exemplary careers that do things that are so different from what other artists and photographers have done, that they really expand our vocabulary of the natural world. Jean, you work, on, as I said, the most difficult continent on the planet, a place where, in fact, Stephen Pine, the historian, writing in his magisterial tome, The Ice, about Antarctica, basically proposed that it was impossible to produce modernist art in the environment because the Antarctic was already a modernist place. I think you've thumped that idea on its head pretty soundly. And I look forward to seeing what you do next. And, we carry many of your materials in the archives at the museum. And I look forward to updating those with these new works from you, because I think you're going somewhere remarkable. And Daniel, I am so thrilled to become acquainted with your work in the books and now in this conversation. I look forward to seeing you in Switzerland this fall when I'm there, and to kind of understand more how you've knit together a remarkable journey that is so heartfelt. At the same time, it's extremely formal and rigorous. It is just deeply implicated in the dynamics of contemporary society as well as history. And so I think the Alps is actually a very unique and valuable place to do that because of Switzerland's own history. So I look forward to knowing your work better over time. And so with that, I think I'm going to bring us to a conclusion. It's now just at the hour. And gentlemen, thank you very much for the conversation today. And thank you, Photo London.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Thanks all. Thank you.